the cloud. References to external media have been blocked. Okay. No, I think it's okay. All right. We're recording. The room is open. Yeah. And we don't really even need to do video since no one else is here. This is totally fine. And if people pop in, they'll be able to hear my voice, no problem. So welcome back. This is our 6th session of building better media habits. Of course, I'm Dr. Cory Barker, assistant professor at Bradley, and had a little summer break, and now we're back here talking about media literacy and media habits. For those of you in the audience, our large group here, anything from the summer related to media literacy, reflecting on, you know, your habits during the summertime that you wouldn't mind sharing? Anybody? Nothing new emerged? Yeah. Alice?
My kids, oh my goodness, I wanted to throw their phones away. There was a lot, we traveled, and so there was lots of phone time in the car and that kind of thing. I mean, for all of us, though, not just them. I can't knock them without knocking myself on there too.
Yeah.
But I also feel like I ended up with COVID after vacation. And so I don't know what it was, but when I was isolated, I didn't want my phone. I don't know why.
Interesting.
I watched TV.
Yeah.
Books, but like, and I don't know if I had a headache. I'm not really sure if it was mild, but still.
Yes.
I don't know what it was, but I was like, it wasn't entertaining me like it can from time to time.
Yeah. Doing a bunch of travel myself over the summer, I found that like when I'm not in my own spaces, you know, if I'm at parents or in-laws or friends or whatever, I tend to use my phone a lot more, right? When you're in your own space and you have access to your own TV or other things that are in your home. And then when you're not in your own space, the phone is such an easy go-to of like, okay, this is not my TV, or we have a more community choice of what we're watching, or, you know, somebody in the extended family is talking and you don't really care what they're talking about. You know, I think the phone has become such an easy crutch for those particular moments when you're out of your own space. Even for me as a person who's tried to be more, intentional about how I use my phone at home. And I think the other thing obviously that comes to mind is with my 18-month-old, trying to just continue to keep phones and tablets away from him, but then realizing, he definitely has his affinity for certain things on the TV, right? So like we've already decided TV can be okay, especially when you're doing other things, but we're not like looking and holding the screen, so that it feels better in some way because he's not directing it or he's not holding it. If it's over there and you're also destroying the room, then that's fine. So today's session is actually inspired by a book that I read this summer and had to review for a library association. And it made me think a lot differently actually about some of the things that we've discussed. And so we've obviously talked about these ideas of like the filter bubble, echo chambers online, and we'll review those here really quickly. And I've got a clip from a TED talk that I've used many times in classes because it's a few years old now. And thinking about the power of these things, like us getting into our own little silos of information and what sort of effect that has on us. This book did a really extensive cross-sectional study of people across 9 Western democracies, and I can list them if folks want, but a bunch of different countries, and found some really interesting things about how people view their social media use, what they do with it, and how that connects to politics and whether or not they're confronting or encountering different types of information, right? So in some ways contrasting some of the things that we've talked about here, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to show, and maybe you've seen this before, but this is kind of an infamous TED Talk. It's all the way back to 2014. So I feel like peak TED Talk time when people were sharing this type of stuff online, especially, when I was in grad school, I was teaching public speaking, and there was a lot of, show people TED Talks to learn how to do public speaking. But this is from Eli Pariser. I'm not sure actually how he totally pronounces his name. We'll maybe be reminded at the beginning of the talk here. And he wrote a really influential book that has been, a New York Times bestseller, but also cited thousands of times and is used almost in the ideas in the book are used as basically common knowledge or accepted practice, especially in political media, research in media. And so this is a really good way to get into this conversation, thinking about where we were all the way back in 2014 and some of the fears that people had about social media that could continue to emerge and have emerged since then. So hopefully this works.
Mark Zuckerberg, a journalist, was asking him a question about the news feed. And the journalist was asking him, why is this so important? And Zuckerberg said, a squirrel dying in your front yard may be more relevant to your interests right now than people dying in Africa. And I want to talk about what a web based on that idea of relevance might look like. So when I was growing up in a really rural area in Maine, the internet meant something very different to me. It meant a connection to the world. It meant something that would connect us all together. And I was sure that it was going to be great for democracy and for our society. But there's this kind of shift in how information is flowing online. And it's invisible. And if we don't pay attention to it, it could be a real problem. So I first noticed this in a place I spend a lot of time, my Facebook page. I'm progressive politically, big surprise, but I've always, gone out of my way to meet conservatives. I like hearing what they're thinking about. I like seeing what they link to. I like learning a thing or two. And so I was kind of surprised when I noticed one day that the conservatives had disappeared from my Facebook feed. And what it turned out was going on was that Facebook was looking at which links I clicked on. And it was noticing that actually I was clicking more on my liberal friends' links than on my conservative friends' links. And without consulting me about it, it had edited them out. They disappeared. So Facebook isn't the only place that's doing this kind of invisible algorithmic editing of the web. Google's doing it too. If I search for something and you search for something, even right now at the very same time, we may get very different search results. Even if you're logged out, one engineer told me, there are 57 signals that Google looks at. Everything from what kind of computer you're on, to what kind of browser you're using, to where you're located, that it uses to personally tailor your query results. Think about it for a second. There is no standard Google anymore. And the funny thing about this is that it's hard to see. You can't see how different your search results are from anyone else's. But a couple of weeks ago, I asked a bunch of friends to Google Egypt and to send me screenshots of what they got. So here's my friend Scott's screenshot. And here's my friend Daniel's screenshot. When you put them side by side, you don't even have to read the links to see how different these two pages are. But when you do read the links, it's really quite remarkable. Daniel didn't get anything about the protests in Egypt at all in his first page of Google results. Scott's results were full of them. And this was the big story of the day at that time. That's how different these results are becoming. So it's not just Google and Facebook either. This is something that's sweeping the web. There are a whole host of companies that are doing this kind of personalization. Yahoo News, the biggest news site on the internet, is now personalized. Different people get different things. Huffington Post, Washington Post, New York Times, all flirting with personalization in various ways. And where this moves us very quickly toward a world in which the internet is showing us what it thinks we want to see, but not necessarily what we need to see. As Eric Schmidt said, it'll be very hard for people to watch or consume something that has not, in some sense, been tailored for them. So I do think this is a problem. And I think if you take all of these filters together, if you take all of these algorithms, you get what I call a filter bubble. And your filter bubble is kind of your own personal, unique universe of information that you live in online. And what's in your filter bubble depends on who you are, and it depends on what you do. But the thing is that you don't decide what gets in. And more importantly, you don't actually see what gets edited out. So one of the problems with the filter bubble was discovered by some researchers at Netflix. And they were looking at the Netflix queues and they noticed something kind of funny that a lot of us probably have noticed, which is there's some movies that just sort of zip right up and out to our houses. They enter the queue, they just zip right out. So Iron Man zips right out, right? And Waiting for Superman can wait for a really long time. What they discovered was that in our Netflix queues, there's kind of this epic struggle going on between our future aspirational selves and our more impulsive present selves. You know, we all want to be someone who has watched Rashomon. But right now, we want to watch Ace Ventura for the 4th time. So the best editing gives us a bit of both. It gives us a little bit of Justin Bieber and a little bit of Afghanistan. It gives us some information vegetables. It gives us some information dessert. And the challenge with these kind of algorithmic filters, these personalized filters, is that because they're mainly looking at what you click on first, you know, it can throw off that balance. And instead of a balanced information diet, you can end up surrounded by information junk food. So what this suggests is actually that we may have the story about the internet wrong. In a broadcast society, you know, this is how the founding mythology goes, right? In a broadcast society, there were these gatekeepers, the editors, and they controlled the flows of information. And along came the internet, and it swept them out of the way, and it allowed all of us to connect together, and it was awesome. But that's not actually what's happening right now. What we're seeing is more of a passing of the torch from human gatekeepers to algorithmic ones. And the thing is that the algorithms don't yet have the kind of embedded ethics that the editors did. So if algorithms are going to curate the world for us, if they're going to decide what we get to see and what we don't get to see, then we need to make sure that they're not just keyed to relevance. We need to make sure that they also show us things that are uncomfortable or challenging or important. This is what TED does, right? Other points of view. And the thing is, we've actually kind of been here before as a society. In 1915, it's not like newspapers were sweating a lot about their civic responsibilities. Then people kind of noticed that they were doing something really important. That in fact, you couldn't have a functioning democracy if citizens didn't get a good flow of information. That the newspapers were critical because they were acting as the filter, and that journalistic ethics developed. It wasn't perfect, but it got us through the last century. And so now we're kind of back in 1915 on the web. And we need the new gatekeepers to encode that kind of responsibility into the code that they're writing. You know, I know there are a lot of people here from Facebook and from Google, Larry and Sergey, who, you know, people who have helped build the web as it is, and I'm grateful for that. But we really need you to make sure that these algorithms have encoded in them a sense of the public life, a sense of civic responsibility.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. So this video was uploaded on YouTube. It's actually older, 2011, so over 11 years old. Any just like thoughts on what's being said here versus where we are now in 2022, like reflecting on what he's calling for versus where we are? Did he get what he asked for, or?
It's scary that it's been going on that long, and I feel like we're really just in maybe the last 4 or 5 years in tune with what he's saying.
Uh-huh.
I feel like more people now like realize that those are the truths when those truths go back at least that far, not
Right.
further.
Yeah.
As far as algorithms and filtering and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. It's like now we're awakened to that and when that's been happening.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just a 5-year-old problem.
Not just 11 years. I mean,
Yeah.
he's realizing in 2011.
Right.
It was happening even longer.
Yeah.
so-
Yeah. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes me realize just I mean, for me, just the amount of time that I've been thinking and teaching about this stuff and how that has even evolved and even being, how much time we've spent on the internet, you know, and on these social platforms and how, and you add Google in there and how quickly they've come to, and Amazon and come to dominate so much of what we do and what we think and what we buy and when we buy. But yeah, I mean, even just it's naive, right? That a little bit here of like, well, you know, these folks are in the audience and this is really just what we need. And he's basically saying like, I trust you to do the right thing because you've built this great thing. And I think that's part of it, right? Is that as a society, because these companies brought us so many great things in general, or, you know, day-to-day experiences, or brought products to us faster in the case of something like Amazon, right? And the broader just shine on tech companies in Silicon Valley was there until the last 4 or 5 years, where now we're definitely in a moment where there's far more political skepticism from the, you know, the news industry, but also skepticism from us as consumers, even if we haven't really tailed off in our usage of these things. Like, I think there's a lot more, as you said, awareness that, yeah, this is terrible, or I know what inputs I'm, you know, putting into this system and why I'm getting what I get back. But maybe not necessarily totally changing our habits, myself included, right? Like, on a certain point, we can do as many of these sessions, or I have conversations with people and they ask like, you know, what do you do instead of using Google? And I'm like, I don't know, man. I use Google for everything. Like, I have a huge Google footprint personally. And then, you know, as soon as you have a job that has like Google Drive or Microsoft or whatever you're using, then you're fully embedded in that system. It's like, I'm not going to do anything because that's what I'm using. Right. But so this idea takes off, and even by the time you give a TED talk, most of them have a book in the queue or whatever. And yeah, like I said, I taught this and I continue to teach this. And what's fascinating, just reflecting on my own experience, is that this was like a mind-blowing idea for college students in 2011, 2012, even 13, 14. And now when I bring it up in class, like the students already know what I'm talking about. Like it's disseminated that far that we know that that's in some ways, or that we think in some ways, that's what these platforms are like, right? And certainly we know that that's how these platforms are built, that they're algorithmically generated, that they are trying to show us things that they think that we will like, generally to get us to keep clicking and staying on the platforms and ultimately buy stuff, right? Generally. And I think that that's still true. I don't want to suggest that, you know, this is not the goal of Facebook or Twitter or Google, because we have tons of evidence that says that's exactly what their goal is. So just quickly, you know, an echo chamber is an environment where a person encounters information that generally matches their point of view. It's powered by confirmation bias. Obviously, the echo chamber phenomenon predates the internet and social media. It is not something that is only internet specific, right? And I think to some extent, this is one of the areas where scholars have done a nice job refining things, where echo chambers have existed for a long time in media, whether we're talking about radio, print, certainly on television, right? And as we get into cable news, as we've moved to a more personalized media environment, we've moved to an environment that is predisposed to like get us into echo chambers, right? The idea that from personalized or hyper personalized or hyper genre specific radio stations, magazines, cable channels, right? dating back to the mid 20th century and certainly into the late 20th century, before we get widespread internet access and social media, we're already developing those things, right? But the filter bubble is a more internet, social media, algorithmically driven concept, right? That the definition is a state of ideological isolation developed over time online as a result of those personalized algorithmic searches and platforms. And so both of these ideas are fundamentally about seeing information that confirms your priors, things that you already agree with, right? The filter bubble one, I think, takes on a life of its own in the 2010s because of the increased usage of social media, and it provides a little bit of a corrective to the generally positive leaning discourse that social media is great, it brings us together, especially this is when his book comes out and this filter bubble idea really starts to take off is not too long after the Arab Spring. He talked about the protests and social movements in Egypt, and so there's from 2008 to 2012-ish, there's a huge uptick of research and reporting and documentaries that social media, especially like Twitter and YouTube, are going to be used for political revolution, right? And then, there's tons of reporting domestically about how the Obama campaign uses social media and builds this whole infrastructure of outreach and trying to organize both in the first term, but especially the second term, right? The second election, there's tons of reporting about how they built this huge internet and social media infrastructure because by 2012, those things existed and you were able to really leverage them. So we have all that positivity about here's the things that the internet and social media are going to do. The filter bubble idea is kind of one of the first big ones that's well, what about some of these negative implications? And I think we've wrestled with those negative implications or experienced those negative implications a lot more since 2012, right? And certainly, as you alluded to earlier, I think it's hard to deny that, the 2015, 2016, everything surrounding the 2016 presidential election in the United States is hard. It's hard to deny that that's not the flashpoint for so many people who were, as we'll get to later, living in a little bit of a bubble. I think, myself included, probably, that just whatever, I voted for Obama, could be a lot better, but, obviously Hillary's going to win. That is what we're just moving on to the next thing, right? A lot of people were politically activated by, the email scandal, and as much as it existed as such, the reporting, everything related to President Trump, right? Becomes a huge deal. Then we have all the spinning out related to misinformation, disinformation, Russian involvement, all that stuff, right? So it's certainly the last 4 or 5 years, much longer now, it's 6 or 7 somehow, have made that seem so much more important. So both of these have seen increased attention in the last decade. And then I think you see, at least in the media, how journalists who cover this kind of stuff have started to make a little bit more connections between what you see online versus maybe what you see in cable news, and how those things are so interrelated, where misinformation or conspiracy theories percolate on the extreme edges of the internet, and then they eventually make their way to cable news, right? Where cable news talking heads or guests that they bring on start perpetuating those things on cable news, and even in podcasts and talk radio that's politically oriented. So I think there's been a lot more focus on these ideas because we see the interconnectedness of it, right? That it's not just extremism online, that there's a whole ecosystem that privileges, heightened rhetoric, heightened discourse, making people mad. And so cable news folks or radio folks who have, been always looking for ways to keep people engaged, keep people angry, they've obviously pulled away more from the internet. And the argument is that we're further and further siloed in these environments. Okay, so you see then through tons of different reporting, right? I just pulled 3 random headlines from the past 5 or 6 years that, your feeds online are echo chambers, and then a few news organizations including BuzzFeed. They did this. They were committed to this for a while when they had a really robust news organization, that they were going to report stories as fairly as they could, but then they were going to, provide updates as far as how people were reacting to those stories, whether they were BuzzFeed reported or elsewhere across the quote unquote political spectrum, that was trying to push to people, especially younger people, like, you're probably in these filter bubbles, you're probably in an echo chamber, you need to see other perspectives. And that lasted for a bit. And even President Obama, especially since he's left the White House, this has been one of his major initiatives as far as trying to raise awareness for the fact that in his mind, people are in basically, different informational ecosystems and universes. He's given a lot of public speeches about this. He's, created a bunch of initiatives related to his foundation. This was just from earlier this year. He gave a big speech at a Stanford event. When he spoke for an hour, where he outlined the threat that disinformation online, including deepfake technology powered by AI, poses to democracy, as well as the ways he thought the problems might be addressed in the United States and abroad. This is an opportunity, a chance that we should welcome for governments to take on an important problem and prove that democracy and innovation can coexist. So, he talked for a long time about all the issues that we've talked about in these sessions. I could talk for a really long time that he sort of waited until he didn't have any legislative power to say, we should do something about this. But at least, statistically, still the most popular politician in the United States, or person who's been involved in politics, like every time they do those sort of personality or polling, like who do you like the best? He's still at or near the top. And he's now saying this is a huge issue, right? That we live in these silos. There's been a lot of academic research or academic adjacent sort of popular academic research that has done cross-sectional studies and studied, millions of tweets or Facebook posts that confirms in some ways that these things do exist, right? That these phenomenon contribute in some way to increase political polarization, that they lead to more circulation of misinformation and ultimately lead to extremism, at least extremism in ideology, not necessarily acts of extremism. But, there've been a handful of books that have done pretty well with this idea, right? One was called #Republic, and there were a few in that series from that scholar. The one that I have looked into more and read a good chunks of is Network Propaganda. And they did this extensive breakdown of the network architecture, as they call it, which is here on the screen, of the political media environment. And I'm just going to read this a little bit here. So, using network analysis of articles shared or referenced on the open web, Twitter and Facebook, and this is millions of articles that they were looking at, the authors found that the structure and composition of media on the right and left are quite different. The center of gravity of the overall media landscape is the center left, and the partisan media sources on the left are less important to the center left. Essentially meaning that there's a whole lot of gravity in the center left, as we might expect. With in this graph here, you can see NPR, New York Times, CNN, etc. On the other hand, the center of attention and influence for conservative media is further to the right, notably more prominent than on the center right, which is of minor importance and least represented. And this book came out, and this research was being done 2015, 2016. So this is even, this is at the beginning of the things that we've talked about, right? Where they note that Breitbart and the Daily Caller are the big two, which, Breitbart has lost a lot of luster as far as being a centerpiece of right-wing, extreme ideology and misinformation. But underlining this idea that, generally speaking, the media is pretty center field with a left leaning, if we're using those traditional definitions. But the extreme left, in as much as it exists, is very fringe and does not have much of an effect. And so if people are in that sort of ideological framework in any kind of bubble, they're way far afield, and that most people are in this kind of mainstream center left silo, but the folks that are extreme on the right actually have quite a bit of influence, that people are sharing articles from them, they're clicking on them. And so if we believe these ideas related to filter bubbling, if those more extreme examples are, influential, that is leading people down a further path of, as this argues, like propaganda and extremism. However, and that's where I'll pivot a little bit, and this book inspired me to think through this, because basically, this is where I've always been. Like, this is what I thought was happening. These are the things to discuss. And I knew that it's not obviously black and white, but there is actually a more complicated picture of this stuff. And we'll post these slides and direct links to some of these studies if people want to read them. Excuse me. There is a little bit more of a complex picture here. So academic researchers did a study 2015 of 150 million tweets, primarily in the US, that found ideological symmetry in political conversations, but not in other current events, meaning that, yes, when political, quote unquote, things were happening, it did seem like that people who fell on one side of the aisle, if we're using that dynamic, were basically aligned and reacted in the same way, right? Which suggests, there's a sense that people are in a little bit of a chamber of similar ideology. But when it came to broader current events that they were studying at the time in like 13 and 14, that there was a lot of cross-section engagement and disagreement across these things, so that there's a little bit of political symmetry, but not across everything, that not everything was politicized and not everything was totally aligned. Few years later, a study of multiple countries, including the US, found that actually, that when we're talking about people being influenced by what they see on social media, it's actually folks who are incidentally exposed who can be more impacted by it, which maybe makes some sense, right? That if you're super engaged, it's maybe hard to be impacted by each new piece of news because you're already pretty engaged, right? And if you're not engaged at all, then you're not online, you're not engaged at all. So the people are kind of in between, who are maybe using social media for other things and encounter news, but they're not really thinking about it in a political context, that they actually can be motivated to change their mind because they're open to anything, really. And we'll talk more about that, but it's teeing up some of the research that's in this book. Multiple studies have actually shown that because social media, like our social media accounts, are in some ways driven by weak ties, right? That our connections on a lot of these platforms are coworkers, people we went to college with, people from high school that we would absolutely never talk to again, right? Extended family, random people that you meet at events that you don't remember why you're connected to them, friends of friends, et cetera, right? Because it's made up of this much larger network than you have in your everyday life, that actually on social media, you see way more ideological diverse news than you might think, right? That because you're connected, quote unquote, to some people that you would not really be connected with in any meaningful way, even 20 years ago, that there's actually some ideological diversity on social media that's not talked about a lot, right? And I find that to be a really interesting idea. And so that lines up this new book, which is called Outside the Bubble, from a couple of European researchers. And it's a really, in many ways, dry academic study, but it underlines the complex picture with really cool empirical data, where they surveyed folks across 9 Western democracies and asked them tons of questions about the things that we're discussing. And they found a lot of different meaningful pieces of information. Excuse me. One, that most social users in these areas encounter similar amounts of agreeable and disagreeable political content, meaning that most people who were asked this question said that they feel like that they see things that they agree with and things that they disagree with in equal order, that they don't actually only see things that they agree with. And they found it common to see things that they disagreed with. And to underline what we talked about on the last slide, that there is a lot of accidental exposure, right? That you're not really seeking out agreeable or disagreeable content, but someone in your extended network who maybe you like, maybe you know, or maybe you don't like and you don't know that well, is posting things, and suddenly you're exposed to something. Now, the scary version of that we see all the time, and that I've used as an example in sessions like this and in classes or whatever, is that like you're somebody who you're accidentally exposed to something that you've never thought about before, and then that sends you down the rabbit hole, right? And I think that absolutely does happen. This is not to suggest that that does not happen. What this book is arguing is that potentially the scale or the frequency at which those type of events are happening is actually a little bit more minimal than we might think, right? Especially because we tend to, maybe associate these things when I feel like this is used all the time now, because unfortunately we have mass shootings all the time now, but very often there's a mass shooting and very quickly we're talking about their social media, habits. They were on these platforms, they're on these websites, they fell down this rabbit hole, they believed in this radical idea, this conspiracy theory, right? That is all true in as much as we're being told that it's true. I'm not debating that, but I think we see these high profile examples of people being radicalized, and they just started by somebody posting something on Facebook. They were in a group for, we saw a lot of this during early stages of the lockdown, between anti-vaxxing beliefs, and like when there was that real huge, it's gone away to some extent, but there was a peak time for when like QAnon was such a big deal, right? Where people that you knew in your life were suddenly posting about it and maybe going to random events, and the media was covering it, and that's died down. It's not that Q doesn't exist. Well, Q doesn't exist, but that there are still people who believe in the QAnon ideas, right? But I think what this book is arguing, that if you go bigger, if you go like cross-sectional, cross-country, across cultures, that those incidents are more isolated than maybe we think, right? Or what we previously thought, and they're backing that up with tons of research. And in fact, a lot of people would say, when they're asked the question, that they actually see a lot of things that they disagree with. So I've got more, but what do we think about that? Are you surprised to hear that? Or are you thoughts?
It doesn't, well, it doesn't surprise me either, but like I need you to tell me that that's the case.
Right. Yes, it's sort of like, if you're interested in these things, or you think about them, right? You come to a session like this, you teach it, you work at a library, right? You have your own confirmation bias about like, these are problems, right? These are problems that need to be solved. And every time you see even just like each new individual person that you see in your life, in your network, that posts something on a social platform, and you're like, oh man, them, that just further confirms, which is a Facebook enabled thing, but it's also one of those situations where you don't know for sure if like they're posting that thing because Facebook showed it to them or YouTube showed it to them, or they would have always believed that kind of thing, and now you're just seeing it because it's a public forum basically, and it's a colleague of a colleague or a spouse of a colleague or whatever, and they would have always had views that you disagreed with. You just maybe would have never confronted them or seen them at all, encountered them, because whatever, people don't talk about that stuff in interpersonal situations, which is something we're going to get to. So that's one of the biggest challenges of this, is like, it's really hard to be able to tell if, without like literally, investigating everybody's personal search histories, like, did people already believe this in certain cases, and then they sought some things out, and then yes, they were nudged maybe by the platforms. And I think all of those things are true, and that this book is just one piece of that, where they're saying like, we're not arguing that there are not examples of people being radicalized, or people feeling like they're in these silos or being in these silos. What we are arguing is that actually we do encounter stuff that we disagree with more than we think, you know? Because on some level, it feels like if we took this as the more sophisticated picture that it is, the more complex picture that it is, if we start from that premise, then it seems impossible for how to fix it, right? Like if we say, actually, we encounter some good, some bad, then that's a really easy way to let these big tech companies off the hook, right? Because there's no push to legislate or to change what they do. So I think on some level, there has been this huge just, siren cry for like, this is bad, right? Like this is not a good situation. And we can point to each of these examples, and we can obviously point to the changing political discourse and rhetoric in this country. We can point to acts of extremism and say, look, these platforms are obviously part of it. The idea that Facebook or YouTube or, Reddit or 4chan or Twitter or whatever are not part of, some of the things that led to, I don't know, the insurrection on the US Capitol, right? The idea that social media is not a role in that is silly. But I think it is also really easy to say, well, all these people are in Facebook groups where they're just seeing more and more extremism, especially during the pandemic. People are locked down, they're not engaging with people face to face, right? That's the challenge. And that's something that we'll get to in a second. But what do you do when you see things that you disagree with on social media from people like that you're connected with? What is your general move to that?
I text my sister on the side.
Right, you go immediately to a private communication, you screenshot and you're like, can you believe this? Yes.
Too, like you said, it's kind of like social norms have gone out the window, right? It is in-play conversation to talk about religion, politics, those types of things.
Right, money, whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
How we all raise.
Yeah.
Like if you're at a party, you don't
Right.
discuss those things because
Right.
it's impolite.
Yeah,
So the whole social norm impolite conversation thing is gone out the window because you can do that online
Right.
and you can scream at people you don't even know or that you do know intimately
yeah,
because they're your cousin or your uncle, whatever it
Yeah.
is, so then it divides,
Yeah.
it just divides you
yes,
when like for me, it's more the people that intimately in your
Yep.
life that now all that dirty laundry is like in your face.
Yep.
And you're like, snooze you for 30.
yep,
30
Yes,
days
absolutely,
because
yes.
I love you.
right.
I can't take
I don't want to be
that.
mad at you. I don't have the bandwidth for this right now.
And not talk to
Yep.
you because this garbage,
Yep.
what I consider garbage,
Right.
but you deeply believe
Yep.
is now in my face.
Yes.
And that mask has been lifted.
Yeah.
and It's ugly. It's
And
just
well, I
ugly.
can be like, there's I think an acquaintance, I guess, I won't call this person a close friend. I mean,
Yeah.
They're not, it's like a friend's brother's wives or something. I don't know. Posts. Just things I don't do.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
But then when you see that person in person.
Right.
You
They
gotta,
don't, yeah.
Yeah.
They don't know that I have like completely blocked them or
Right,
whatever.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right,
right.
You're on the same
right.
page and then.
And that's like the two sides, both sides of the coin. It's like, you can imagine a world where, again, you don't know those things about that person, or maybe there's a stray comment at a dinner or whatever. And like, you think about it, but yeah, it's just, there were certain things that we didn't know about each other
Right.
that we do for a large majority of us. Yes, absolutely. And I think most of us would agree that's a net negative, right? And like, there is an argument to be made that like some things should be talked about more, but the degree at which we talk about them, and as you said, the fact that it's a different type of discourse, right? That it's rarely is there any, even if you had a heated argument in person with somebody that you knew or kind of knew, right? Even that, generally, we can imagine that taking on a slightly less intense tone than just like every 5 minutes online, right?
Yes.
Like, and now we see, I think we all feel how that tone online does now carry into in-person settings where in the most passionate instances or extreme instances, where people are yelling at each other or getting violent at each other in public spaces in just a way that did not happen as regularly. And again, I'm being anecdotal, but that's how we feel, and that's hard to wrestle with. Again, like it is a really complex picture, but when you're using these things so regularly and you're inundated with them and you start thinking about some of the complicated or negative consequences of that use, then it's hard to not see each example of, great, another cousin I got to mute, or another, I don't know. I'm not even connected with that many people from my graduating high school class. I'm from a very small town, but the people that it's just like, it'll come up and I'm like, wow, I'm down to like 6 people that I graduated high school with. And those are the ones that I already like text regularly. Anyway, it's like my actual friends but and you see the different waves of stuff, right? It's like, oh, that person is trying to get me to join an MLM, right? That person believes in QAnon. Like this person, thinks that the vaccine has a chip in it or what, things like that. Or way more hateful things, but that's absolute. I think we all the people who feel this way about social media and what it's done to us, I think on some level have gone through the waves of, everybody's tried, right? We've all tried from time to time to like reply to a comment and be like, actually, if you look at this article, or if you think about it, that we've all been there. That didn't work. We've tried the flippant, sarcastic comment that basically says like, you don't know what the heck you're talking about, right? Maybe we've gotten into an argument or two. And now, yeah, the answer is just like, I want this process to be smoother for me. So I'm just going to, if I don't want to unfriend or unfollow, I'm going to snooze, right? Or I'm going to mute, right? And that makes our experience better. But if we follow this logic on some level, that would further get us into a bubble and an echo chamber. What's really fascinating about this book, and obviously now that we've got the screen smaller here, I'll just show you a screenshot here, or a photo I took with my phone from the book. I couldn't find a digital copy. So, people were asked, not just social media, but then what about their offline conversations? Because I think we're talking about this now, that like in person, you wouldn't do this or whatever. So they felt like that they were encountering, two-sided conversations on social media, like 50% of the time, actually. And then they were only including, encountering things that one side and supported what they believed 15% of the time. And then 30% of the time, like one-sided that they disagreed with. So that they were actually, if you add two-sided, quote unquote, and one-sided oppositional, that's over 80% of people said they were like, they were encountering, or they felt like 80% of the time they were encountering one of those two things. In contrast, offline conversations, far more on just one-sided conversations that support what I believe, right? And a lot of two-sided, but not as much of I'm being exposed to basically one-sided things that I disagree with. So I think what's notable about this is that the study finds generally that the things that we believe about the internet are actually far more common in our day-to-day, face-to-face, in-person lives. That actually our circles of the people that we talk to regularly in person are far more echo chambery, because we've actually made the choice to be around them regularly. And if we're making that choice, they probably are generally agreeable to us, right? That generally, the people in our families, our spouses, our closest friends, what have you, are people who we agree with ideologically. And I think we often do that where we say like, we used to have friendly debates or friendly discussions in person, right? And now online, we're either in filter bubbles or we're screaming at each other, right? And what they found is that people generally said, actually, I encounter way less oppositional information or way less things that I disagreed with in person, because I mostly am hanging out with people who I agree with, who I like. So I think that that's an interesting, different way to think about this, that we often say internet bad, social media bad for these reasons, among many others, right? But we rarely do we say like, our in-person lives have been filtered, right? That our in-person is an echo chamber. We're often looking at external factors like the media or technology as a big part of the reason why we're in these bubbles, but we actually create bubbles all the time. We create them with our family, right? We create them if we have a small network of friends that we talk to, right? Of course, again, it's complex. You engage with coworkers that, that's the most obvious example. Not at all speaking from personal experience. You engage with, that's like a place where you clearly engage with people that you don't choose necessarily who those people are, right? So clearly you engage with, but you also have the ability to just like walk away from that person. You don't hang out with them outside of work, those sort of things. So that's one big piece. And then they also found, to some of the other studies, that those who are most politically engaged, right, the people who are using social media to get political information and news, are actually the ones who are most likely to be in those bubbles, right? And that's a much smaller percentage of people than we think. So that we have, a little bit of a bell curve situation happening here, where we have the people who are really, really hyper engaged, and they're driving so much of the activity on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. Then there's a smaller number of people who are just not in these spaces at all. And then there's this big meaty middle of people who are on these platforms who are not really looking at political news or political information at all. But even those people, even the most politically engaged people, the ones that, feel like, or are in their responses reflecting on being in a bubble or a chamber, they still say, I see stuff I disagree with. Even like, if we could say this is a person who's in an echo chamber, those people are still saying, you know what, I still see things that I disagree with. So really interesting survey results from these folks. Again, cross-sectional of people, ages, everything like that, countries. And that leads to, a few final notes here, that fewer people engage with politics online than we tend to think, and are reading political news than we tend to think. But again, it's those who are less interested and less attentive that actually can be impacted by it, because there's, they can be moved because they don't know as much. They're maybe not politically activated, but, and I think we're starting to reckon with that a little bit, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, even in the primary, where we see that like a lot of the attention and even news coverage and things that become issues among different sides of the political spectrum, we're talking about like the most passionate people who are arguing about this stuff online. We saw it, in the Democratic primary, for instance. So many people, truly, so many people were supporting Bernie Sanders, for instance, but having a super active, extremely online, supporter base does not necessarily translate to basically all of these other people who just didn't want Donald Trump to be president anymore. And we're like, okay, well, if it's going to be Joe Biden, he was vice president, I'll vote for Joe Biden, right? I don't even like Joe Biden necessarily, but I don't want to vote. I don't want Trump to be president. I'll vote for Joe Biden, right? Like that's like the Biden sales pitch. And so many, people who were Bernie supporters or Warren supporters who are more predisposed to be online, college educated, arguing about the issues or whatever, just like couldn't wrap their heads around it, myself included at times, just like, why are we doing? And it's just like, because so many more people are in this coalition and they are not on Twitter. They don't care about what you're arguing about. What they care about is not having this person be president anymore. And they're like, who is the person that person was in the White House before, I've seen him on TV, great, right? And that's not to belittle those people's engagement with politics. It's just, that's the level they're engaging with. And those people, could be motivated by like, okay, we've got to get rid of Donald Trump or whatever, if that's what they believed. So the other thing here is that those who locate themselves on the extremes are not disproportionately activated by political experiences, which basically just means, even those folks who are in those bubbles who feel like they're like really, really engaged, they're not super moved by political experiences or information that they find online to such a degree. Especially in contrast to those people in the middle who, because they don't have a strong opinion, they can be swayed one way or another. And again, screenshot here just to underline this just really quickly. So thinking about mass media versus social media versus like instant messaging and offline conversations. Once again, the category that has the most one-sided information that supports what they agree with, they said offline conversations, 37%, text message or instant messaging, 28%, social media, 23%, and then mass media, 18%. So actually, giving a shout out to newspapers and radio and TV there, but offline conversations being the most one-sided. So what does that mean? Like, do we feel like that are our in-person filter bubbles actually something we should spend more time thinking about? How do we step outside of that at all? Like, what do we think about this online offline contrast? Because I think that was something I was struck by so much. Like, I could understand, yes, not everybody is like activated and becomes an extremist by reading information online, right? Or not everybody is in knee deep into that's not a good metaphor, but super deep into a filter bubble and is therefore then going to go commit acts of political extremism that for most people, it's just like, whatever, right? But this idea that actually our in-person lives are where at least these folks, tens of thousands of people surveyed feel like our in-person life is where it's really the bubble. Should we talk about that more? Is that something that we should try to attack, or is that just the nature of human, interpersonal connection?
Yeah, I think it's that. I think so for us, my husband and I, we are Catholic. We sent our children to Catholic grade school and high school.
Yeah.
So most of our closest friends are from that world
Right.
that we raised our family in.
Yeah.
And so that's who we socialize, and our closest friends are from those social bubbles of, our grade school church and then our people we met in high school.
Yeah.
But I will say, while I think we're drawn to them just A, because our children,
Right.
but B, because as Christian ideological people who are kind and live life a certain way, we're drawn to people who are that same way,
right,
and walk through life that way. Being not all Christians are kind.
Of course, right. Yeah, absolutely. You're seeking out people who are similar, right?
Have those similar values.
Yes.
Similar values.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
So we have that, but I do know also that my husband and I are very much politically center. And a lot of those people are politically on the right.
Right.
And so it is. That's a topic you avoid. It's a topic you don't talk about in person, right? And it came up once about the gun control issue and one of the other husbands, and it was an interesting conversation. It was a conversation there, but didn't get heated. But it was a conversation. He said, "I had this conversation, blah blah blah." I'm like, "Well, did you really expect something different?"
Right.
And he said, "Well, no, I guess not."
Right.
But it never come up before. Right? Because we don't go there, because we know we're center.
Right.
And we know that a lot of those people are not.
Right.
And I see it on Twitter, and there's one of our friends, every time that the POTUS Twitter tweets something, he's like, "But you."
Right.
And I just laugh. I'm like, why? And I never say it, but I'm like,
this is not
engaging.
Right. This is not the one of all things to engage with. Right. Yeah. Right.
So like, why? Do you think this matters? Do you think that they're reading millions of people that are seeing this and tweeting back? Like, does it make you feel better? I guess it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
But I know we just go, okay, whatever, and move on.
Yeah.
But it hasn't. We've never let it prevent the friendships from moving forward, because there's that one faction of our friendship that doesn't coincide with who we are. So
and I think that's another complication to it, right? Where it is a little easier to, I think, point to social media and media as a whole as how that has kind of fed and complicated those in-person relationships. Like, as we were talking about earlier, I even sense it in my own family, I think generally, I would say my extended family, I don't have these examples of like we're excommunicating somebody or that there's even been like huge extreme differences. But I think there have been in the last, 5 to 7 years, way more just conversations about politics broadly defined in a way that simply were not happening. And I don't think that that's just a manifestation of me now being in my 30s. I think like in my extended family, like at events that, previously they would just be talking about whatever the sports team and, the weather or whatever. It now elevates into like small talk where people, I feel like just say things. And sometimes I'm just like, seriously, like we've been here for 9 minutes and you're bringing up, whatever it is, even people who I agree with. I'm like, no, like I do not want to talk about the Supreme Court or what, like, geez, like it's Christmas Eve, or whatever.
That recently happened at our house.
Yeah.
It was family, friend groups. We're all on the same page. pretty much.
Yeah.
So we don't really, we're more just there to have fun with each
Right,
other.
absolutely, yeah.
Conversation. They,
Yeah.
ridiculously light. Yeah, for family, and choose them.
Yeah.
Where they are. We had some extended family at the house and I wasn't sure the way one of the people. was.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Yeah.
sure. And fast forward to the end of the evening, and it was just my mom with us, and I said, I didn't know that so-and-so leaned this way.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure where he was, and she said, oh, no, he, blah, blah, blah.
Right,
Well, a heads up about that would be good, because he started down a path of something,
right,
I thought he was going this way.
Right. right.
But I didn't know. Then if they hadn't seen.
Yes, yeah,
And so the whole time he's talking, I'm just kind of like bite my tongue and not sure where to go with it.
yeah,
It can be really awkward. It can be interesting.
yes,
I mean, these were, it's a very.
And remain civil.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
Right.
Well-educated people in there with, and it was,
Right.
a very interesting conversation once I realized, oh, okay, we're on the same page.
Yeah.
But the way he started, I was like.
yeah, and I,
You just don't know.
yes, and I think, every experience is obviously different. One of the things that I think, just for me personally, I get this stuff from people because like in the extended family, like nobody else in my family is a college professor, right? Or no one else is, who teaches this type of stuff. So I feel like it's like one of those that people just want to talk to me about it, or they feel like they want to tell me their opinions on it. Anytime those conversations get heated, it's when it's less often like political topics, but it comes out when you can tell that just like people in the hyper conservative members of my family are just like hate the New York Times or whatever. And you're just like, whatever, man. Like I don't work at the New York Times, but like there's more of an anger about particular media sources that then feel like they want to come up. But I think the way in which these things kind of feed into one another is what makes those in-person conversations more fraught, because I feel like, yes, people might say that they're in these bubbles a lot more in their like very, very tight circles. Cause yeah, like you're going to mostly agree with your best friends. Like that's how they become your best friend. Right. But I think as you extend that network in person, just like we talked about online, I just feel like it's not just social media. I think that TV and radio and even print so relies on what people are talking about on social media or what has become a controversy. And we've just, obviously our former president was addicted to social media, right? And so those things now, it's not just like extremist or super politically engaged people talking about it in a very small, window or bubble on social media. It's being talked about on cable news. And then if it's loud enough on cable news, then it makes it to NBC, it makes it to CBS, right? And then there's this broader concern about misinformation and disinformation. So not every little thing, because there's too much to capture, but even moderately sized like bits of misinformation. Like I can't even think of one right now, because there are hundreds of examples of like things that become an issue for like a day or 3 days or a week, that like, here's this big piece of misinformation and that, and then it just like moves on because there's another thing to talk about, right? And that all trickles in, even if you're not a social media user. If you watch the nightly news now, I'll see that with my parents who they have a Facebook account, they're in their 60s and 70s. They have a Facebook account that they basically do not know how to use. And that's the only social media they've ever even considered. But they'll say things that it's clear, and they watch the night, like ABC 6 p.m. news every single night. And I'm like, the only way they do not watch cable news, like this had to have made it to, it had to have made it to your Facebook feed. And then some of this stuff had to have like trickled into like, well, it was such a big deal that they had to talk about it for 30 seconds on ABC, but they're only getting the ABC distilled weird, national version of what is already a niche thing. And so that creates a weird understanding of these ideas. But yeah, I think this is such a fascinating way to think about it. It's just like, it's so easy, rightfully, to blame Facebook and Google. And I would love to do it every single day of my life. I wish I had more time to be angry at these companies because they're awful in many ways as a user of every single platform. But there is something to be said for like, actually this is not I think the best way to look at it is not as a social media only phenomenon, right? And it's not only a media related phenomenon that we create, being like creating a life is to like filter out all the stuff that you don't like to make you happy, right? And on some level, when you make choices to make yourself happy, you're obviously making active choices to avoid things that make you mad or make you sad or whatever. And that's just a really interesting, kind of way to think about it, in that we do actually create these, filter bubbles, or that does become such an interpersonal way to navigate through life, where you're like, I don't want to engage with this. But I think what's challenging now, to wrap up, is just, that people are willing to talk about this stuff way more because they're influenced by the media. I think that we are more willing to spurt out things, especially I think younger people, not to make it totally generational, that then does impact your interpersonal, life in a way where that's where we see like, I'm cutting this person off, or, I'm on my 3rd date with this person, and can you believe they said this about guns or whatever, and it's like, oh boy, never mind, no, thank you. Right. So I think that this sort of dynamic between those two things, I think, is really fascinating, and something that, I read a lot of books and stuff about this. This is one where I was like, oh, that is actually really fascinating and backed by tons and tons of research. So, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I don't know, I'm just so how it got, and I'm just so curious as to how it got so polarized, and what role the media, social media played in that polarization. I mean, my grandparents, my grandfather was Republican, married to my grandmother, a Democrat. And like, it was just, but they also subscribed to Time, Newsweek, and 4 daily papers.
Right.
And neither of them had more than an 8th grade education.
Right.
So, you know what I mean?
Yes.
I grew up in that kind of world where you just want all the information, and then you talk about it. Right. And then you have dinner.
Right.
Like, it was fine.
Yeah.
So how did we get to this place where the bubbles burst?
Yeah.
And, like, all the garbage is spilling out everywhere.
Well, you're on Facebook, you get those memories from
whatever.
And I look back at the things that I posted however many years ago when I first started on Facebook. It's like, oh, had cereal for breakfast.
Right. Yeah.
And then you look at the things that are more recent, and they're when did we switch from head breakfast cereal to
when they gave us more than 80 characters?
This is
characters.
And I think the reality, I mean, not that you're suggesting otherwise, but the complexities of like, this is where they absolutely are to blame, right? And thinking about their economic imperatives, particularly, Zuckerberg first. I mean, he's the absolute, the villain. And then the Google, not that Google was doing great things before, but then once Google bought YouTube and saw kind of what they could do with that, right? But Zuckerberg was first and in this realm, but just seeing that like, well, the best way to monetize this has to be advertising, right? So we need to tell advertisers that people are clicking this many times, they're on the platform this many times, and seeing, partners or people they went to high school with, or like snooping on people is only going to take us so far. So like, what are we going to, what kind of content are we going to put on here? And we see that in how they always ebb and flow of like, every couple of years, they're like, we're going to fill everybody's feed with news again. Right. And then like something will happen and they'll be like, nope, now it's video. Or right now they're basically done with Facebook and it's all, the metaverse or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
Which it stands to reason that will somehow be like, people are going to be hosting their own like mock insurrections on the US Capitol in the metaverse. But I think there's that piece of it where they have pushed the stuff to us. There's no doubt about it. But I do think, the relationship between that and the way in which those conventional, go back to the talk, the conventional gatekeepers have picked up on this, right? As either to compete for attention or, as they all move, as newspapers move to like digital publishing and they're posting more stuff every day. So it's like the things that are happening online are news items that we can publish, as opposed to news that's happening out in the world. The fact that journalists, in particular, like are obsessed with Twitter, like I was in J school right when Twitter started, and it was very, it became like, that's the platform, because Facebook is like where you post your photos from your party over the weekend in college, right? In 2007, when I'm in college. So Twitter is it's going to be this professionalized space. It's short form, but you can share links really easily. And that's where you're going to build your brand. And so everybody generally, especially like elite level journalists at the biggest publications, spend so much time on Twitter that then, things that are happening on Twitter, they view them to be important, right? Like one of the biggest problems that we have with filter bubbles is that journalists are like stuck in a filter bubble of being on Twitter all the time and thinking that like every, tweet that Trump sends or whatever is like the next, yes, absolutely. When in reality, it's just like, whatever, like clearly, we got to a point where it's bad. I don't want to undermine some of the stakes of his Twitter account, but like, when they were reporting on when he would like mistype something or whatever, it's just like, who cares? Clearly this is a person who has an unhealthy relationship with this platform, just like they do. That's why it was such a big deal for them. So they're beholden to these platforms in a way that then just gets pushed onto us, because it's like, well, they think it's important. They report on what's important, so that now we think it's important. And then it starts pushing just further down the hill. And the platforms keep giving more of that to us. And then I think even realizing that talk happened in 2011 and now we're in 2022, it's like, it's now been 11 years of this stuff and it just rolls downhill, gets more radical. I mean, the versions of this, these type of talks that I would give in 2014, 2015, like the things that were deemed like politically radical in 2014, like today that wouldn't even make the news, right? The things that were a big deal just 6 or 7 years ago, let alone like in the Clinton administration or in, the Nixon administration, you know what I'm saying? Like just the things that.
That was 11 years ago. And it's still going on, and we aren't really doing.
Right. The problem is that we've done nothing. Like we have this moment, and that's the thing. That's why I stopped it there. He says, like, we're looking to you, like, all powerful tech creators. We trust you, fix it, right? And now we know that all they did was like they had a green button and a red button, and they just kept pushing like the red button, like make it worse, for everybody. And now we're in a situation where everybody knows that, but there's not totally enough like push for like government intervention, right? Unless you're the former president, when you can say it after you're president, you're like, actually, this is a problem.
That's true American though, right?
Absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah, how many more mass shootings?
of course.
Do we need to send our prayers and thoughts to?
Yes, of
And
course.
how many more TED Talks or
Yes.
videos do we have to see on, and how many more people testify in front of Congress?
Right.
How many times is Mark Zuckerberg gonna go before Congress before something happens?
Yeah. And I think,
This is America.
right, many more times, right? I think just literally as many times as until he like every 18 months until he dies, basically, right? Like, I don't think, yeah, he gets up there with his like scary blank look and it's just like, I don't know,
Yeah.
and I think, I mean, that's where like part of it is like, these companies are huge economic engines too. So it's just like, we can't just like take them out of the stock market or whatever, even though they're basically fake companies, right? But there's all of the economic capital part of it that, if we had a real functioning society, we would have just, I say this all the time, we would have just said like, we're turning it off and you're going to jail. Like, I don't know what else to say. And sometimes people are taken aback by that, but I'm like, how is that not the solution, right? Like and even in Europe where they've regulated this stuff way more, that's still, it's only regulated to an extent, right? And it's really just a lot of regulation of you getting like pop-up boxes that tell you like, they're going to track you, right? They're going to take all this information from you. Or now it's, and we'll actually wrap up, Apple, like in intention, because Apple has made it a little harder on Apple devices for Facebook to track you so easily, right? So Apple is now being held up as like this bastion of protecting privacy, and like Apple doesn't care about us either, right? They're right. They would, yes, right. Blame them, and then try to like leverage that to make Facebook be Facebook pay them a bigger amount of money to then supersede those privacy controls. It's all silly. So we'll be back next month. That will be October 6th, I think. I looked at it before I got here. Yeah, Thursday the 6th. And well, I'm sure we'll talk about information related to the upcoming midterm elections, given that that'll be a topical subject. So thank you all for joining us. And thanks for those of you who joined us on Zoom. And obviously this will be posted online as all the videos and slides are, and you can watch at any time. Thanks, folks.